Admittedly, wait a minute. Admittedly, that's music that I like a little bit more than I'm sure what Bob Seifers would, being the generations that we have. But this is Tri-City Sports Now. I'm Marky Billson. I'm now joined by Steve Massey, who is a Georgia-based author who has, after writing a couple of books on the Civil War, now taken a foray into sports and written about the Starless Steelers, which was the 1947 Pittsburgh Steelers team, their first season after 15 years of existence to make the playoffs. And if anyone knows Steeler lore, they did not make it again until 1972 in the Immaculate Reception, not including the 1962 playoff bowl. Okay, what does that have to do with East Tennessee? Bob Seifers. I think the greatest high school football player ever to come from the area, after leading the nation in scoring in 1938. I had a friendship with him late in his life. He passed away in 2001. So when a book was written with Bob the Foot Seifers, he was a great punter, and in it, I wanted to have the author on. Starless Steelers, Steve Massey, I got to ask, what was the motivation to write about this team of 70 years ago for you?
Well, thanks for having me on, Marky. I really latched onto the Steelers. I kind of hopped on the bandwagon when I was a little boy, and I stayed on it. Over the years, I enjoyed reading, and I learned about that team, and it was such a remarkable team that I felt like somebody ought to write about it. They were a great group of guys. They were a team in the true sense of the word, and they had a really serious misfortune in the way that the coach died. Jock Sutherland passed away that spring. And so, they just really inspired me, and I decided to write a book about it.
And I'll tell you, Jock Sutherland admittedly died 1948, but was good friends with Bob Nealand. They both had a lot of similar football philosophies. I mean, smash mouth, running the single wing, that sort of thing. Although it should be mentioned that Sutherland, who was the first coach to go from major college football to pro football. Now, he was the first NFL coach to have a college coaching background, Jock Sutherland. But what was kind of surprising about that is that one of the first great quarterbacks in the NFL, his name was Ace Parker, actually played for Jock Sutherland in pro football with the old Brooklyn Dodgers. So he was still able to, understand and cater his team to its talents. But anyway, one of the things, I was reading the book that you had sent me, and I really appreciate that. But let's talk a little bit about this. Bob Seifers, like I said, from Kingsport, Dobyns-Bennett, and he really was a key contributor on the Steelers' first playoff team. He used to always tell me, when they put me in the lineup, that's when they started to win, the Steelers, and they won 6 games in a row, which was their longest winning streak for 28 years. What were some of the contributions when doing your research that you found Bob Seifers to make for this historic team?
Well, I'll tell you, first of all, when the Steelers decided to trade Bill Dudley, they got Bob, and they got another guy named Paul White, and they were both good athletes. But Seifers was already known because of the University of Tennessee for his punting.
Sure.
And, back then, the way that the Steelers ran the single wing was starting to go out of style in the NFL. But the Steelers ran it. Field position was critical in those games. And Seifers, the foot, they called him the foot, the punter, he practically single-handedly won the Giants game late in the season that helped Steelers continue that winning streak. He also had some big punts against Washington, and when they played the Packers that year, it was the first time that they'd ever beaten the Packers up there in Wisconsin. And Bob pinned Green Bay inside the 5-yard line, and that led to a safety, and that ultimately won the game by 1 point.
Well,
but I do want to add something. When Bob really first became notable on that team, it was against the Yanks, the old Boston Yanks, which aren't around anymore. But he had 2 very long runs running point for the team, and this was running the ball. Because, Bob was also a tailback. So, he helped get that offense going, and it stayed going after those big runs.
Now, it's, and I'm glad you mentioned that because, those records, you really do have to go to the microfilm, I think, and look up those games. Now, I do know the old Post-Gazettes are now, it's one of the few major newspapers that you can go online and get their archives, practically all of them, because I have seen that. And it bothers me because you can't do that with a local Tri-Cities paper, or else I'd be, trying to look up these things about, like, the scoreless Dobyns-Bennett Gate City basketball tie and all that. I physically have to go to the library. So that's a plus. But tell me what kind of research you did do on this book, Steve Massey, Starless Steelers.
Well, I'm really glad you asked me that. There's a couple of things I want to say. First of all, my wife is so supportive of me. I was able to do so much research on the team because she knows that's just a devotion of mine is research. And what I managed to do was dug, and I found the old Pittsburgh Tribune online and the Post-Gazette, and
Do you mean the press? Pittsburgh Trib was around in 1992. That was the first year of that. In the 40s, there was the Sun Telegraph, the Post-Gazette, and the Press.
I'm probably thinking about the Press.
Okay, yes.
Thank you.
Pat Livingston's paper, yes.
Mm-hmm. So I was able to consult those as primary sources. I talked to a couple of family members. Valiant Sente Jr. was very helpful to me, and I used a lot of the secondary sources that I had collected since I started collecting literature about the Steelers in the 70s. But it was just a matter of a lot of digging, and then I chose not to put footnotes in the book. That was on purpose. I wanted this to be for football people, girls and guys that just want to read about the game and they don't want all the stuffy footnotes. It was just something that I decided to do. I probably would, my old teachers back in southern Mississippi would be mad at me for doing that. I wanted a fun book.
I can show you where, the first time he had Pat Livingston's name is Pat Livingstone. By the way, great research there because that's something that I did not know, and you got to understand I'm a former sports writer at the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette, but Pat Livingston was the sports editor in the 70s at the Pittsburgh Press, and Vito Stellino, who we have on to talk about pro football, still covers pro football to this day, but he was in competition basically with Pat Livingston, who I think the beat writer he hired in the 70s was Phil Music. But what I found out that was very intriguing here was that here was a guy who was sort of started as a scout, and then he became a publicist, and later the sports editor of the Pittsburgh Press. Now, that's a very unusual background, certainly for a contemporary sports writer. What can you tell me about Pat Livingston? I'm really liking this guy. I mean, anybody who wants to go, did you play that sport? Well, no, I didn't log roll, but I still think I can comment on what I saw, sir. That sort of thing. Tell us a little bit about Pat Livingston. That was something that you uncovered that I really liked.
Well, Pat was like so many people back in that generation. He was just such a person of integrity. He collected all these newspaper clippings, and the Roonies got him something like 65 subscriptions, and he got everything he could find out about every college player from everywhere. And he was really trying to scoop the Bears because they had such a sophisticated system. But what's really interesting about him is that when he does move into sports writing, he doesn't pull any punches. He's not one of these hometown guys. And he got into a pretty nasty confrontation later with Mean Joe Green, and I don't think it's something that the Joe that we know today would be proud of. But he played things fairly when he got in the press, and he was just a really interesting guy in that front office.
That nickname, Mean Joe Green, I mean, yeah, you write about how I guess Green spat in Livingston's face. And I have heard many stories from when he was a young player that he would do stuff like that, I mean, and, story of picking up sod and throwing it at, say, fans who would come out to training camp if they started heckling him. He almost actually quit pro football in 1974 after a disappointing loss, and one of the assistants talked him out of it, and the Steelers went on to win the Super Bowl, and then Joe Green kind of mellowed and became the guy that gives the Coke to the little boy and all that sort of stuff. His reputation changed. I do want to ask you, though, I mean, that you mentioned the trade in the book, and what you speak of is, and I'm speaking here, the Bob Seifers from Kingsport trade for Bill Dudley from Virginia, University of Virginia. And you speak of it, and it speaks of where at one time Bill Dudley starts making suggestions to Jock Sutherland, and Sutherland then sort of lives up to his dour Scot reputation. What in the world are you doing? Are you some sort of troublemaker? No, I'm the coach. You do what I tell you to. And you mentioned that is the motivation for the deal. Can you elaborate a little bit with that?
Oh yeah, absolutely. And it's a great part of Steeler folklore. Dudley was just a great leader, world-class athlete, and he was on the 46th team. And he was the MVP. He's just all league. He's a great guy. He's a great character.
I've heard this from many sources. Yes.
Yeah, but so was Jock, and Jock was the coach, and it wasn't that he was old school or none of that cliched crew cut type of thing, but he just had things done the way he wanted them done. Well, at the end of a long practice, at 3 hours, Bill started misfiring passes, and I think it was Johnny Michelosson came up to him. And, kind of coached him, told him what he was doing wrong, and he started popping off to him. Well, then Sutherland comes over, and, Bill makes a big mistake. He kind of smarts off to Sutherland, and, there's this sort of confrontation, and it eases off. Well, Bill goes later that night to apologize. He realizes he was in the wrong, and he was. And Sutherland doesn't let him get a word in. That's how they played the entire 1946 season. Dudley was just a total class act, and Sutherland was just not going to have a player that would be combative with him. And so that's when they made the trade. And in the long run, it was a great trade for the Steelers.
Well, now, this is what I want to talk to you a little bit about, because Bob would always tell me about how he got traded to the Steelers, and he said that actually Sutherland and Neyland, who were friends, I mean, Neyland went to Sutherland's last game as Pitt's head coach, for instance, half scouting also, I think, just, that they had similar football philosophies and were two of the best coaches of their time. But what you had was a circumstance where Neyland, who of course Seifers had played for him, said, he'll be able to block for you in your single wing for Johnny Clement. And that became a motivation. And you said, we're talking single wing and the flashy passer. No, this is 3 yards in a cloud of dust. That's what we want to do. You mentioned the punt and pinning in the Green Bay Packers game. Yes. I mean, that was offense in that time. Pin him inside the 5. Let's try to get that safety. And then we'll get the ball back maybe at midfield and have a 9-point series, that sort of thing.
You're absolutely right.
Yeah.
But the thing about Neyland is now, see, when John died in the spring of 48, he was actually visiting college coaches in the South. That was how he did the Easter vacation. And that's when they found him wandering around in the field in Kentucky and he didn't know where the heck he was. But I didn't mean to interrupt, but it just kind of thing together. And, Seekers fit perfectly into that single wing offense. And you're absolutely right. Field position was critical. He hit a punt against Washington that bounced on the right side of the field near the sideline, and it skipped horizontally all the way out of bounds to the left and stayed inside of the 5-yard line. I mean, he was just just a phenomenal punter. And a lot of that had to come from Nealon. And, his brother was a great punter, too, Ed. And then they had another brother named Bill. Don't know a lot about him. And then, of course, George died tragically. He was trying to save 2 children, and he drowned. And he was just out of the Navy. He was 21 years old. And, just a great guy, a great man.
Yeah, kind of like Joe Delaney in later generation, who died the same way, drowning trying to save children. So there you go. Now, I do want to, on maybe a happier note here, certainly it would be a happier note, but you also mentioned the winning streak that the Steelers, was a historic winning streak. Even the first Super Bowl team that they had did not win 6 games in a row. You had to go to 75 before that record was broken. You had mentioned that, that game that the Bears beat the Steelers way back when and ended the Steelers' winning streak was actually Ed versus Bob Seifers. And though you don't write about it in the book, I do remember asking the Seifers about that game. And although they never really commented, the facial expressions and the rolling of the eyes let it known that Ed did let Bob know who won that game over the years and such. Did you hear any tales about the brothers facing off against each other, the brothers from Kingsport, in this Bears-Steelers game of 47?
I did include that in the book that they played against one another. I don't know any of the historical things about it, but I can tell you this. If those 2 guys played in that game, Bob knew who won the game, because that was not a happy occasion for that team. The Bears really did a number on them, and it pains me to say that because I'm a Steelers fan, but I got to play it straight.
Oh, yeah, there's no question. That was the first time that it seemed like the team was going to be beatable, although Steeler lore is, and this was taught in the early parts of the franchise, there was a missed kick early on in the season by a guy named Joe Glamp. It was, I think, a game-winning field goal attempt clanked off the crossbar, the goalpost, not the crossbar. And that was it. Steelers lose 27-26. Now, if that kick is good, then the Steelers are, if everything else plays out the way it did, 9-3, and they're playing the Chicago Cardinals for the NFL championship. It's Jock Sutherland versus Marshall Goldberg, which would have been an incredible matchup. Anyone who knows the history of college football could attest to that. And it also would have been the 2 losing franchises, although one could say up to that point the Eagles kind of were. They did have a good run with Steve Van Buren in the end of the 40s, but that would have been the 2 doormats, sort of like the 2016 World Series, the meek inheriting the earth. At that time, Steelers-Cardinals in the NFL title game, that would have been absolutely, wait a minute, it's gone topsy-turvy, this sort of thing.
I write about, actually have a little bit about Steve Van Buren in the book. He's a really great character, and he plays the Eagles. But what's really interesting about that Redskins game is there's an old Steelers book I have that came from this series called Great Teams, Great Years, or something like that. They did them for all of the 2016s back then before expansion, and that game is listed as one of the top 5 games in Steeler history, and they lost that game. But they had like 6-7 league changes in it. Even Jock got animated because he saw Sammy walk up to the line, Sammy Bond. He was looking at his receiver, Bob Nussbaumer, and Jock started hopping up and down, yelling, "Watch Nussbaumer!" But they didn't listen to him, and he scored. But that was a really important game in that year because I think that the Steelers got a lot of confidence from that game that they could hang with the Redskins. And as for Glamp, it just wasn't an area of specialization, so I kind of give him a free pass on that one.
No, it was, though, mentioned. I mean, and again, it's before my time, but to Steelers fans of an era, of a Pitt Stadium, Forbes Field era. Before the Super Bowls, yeah, that was the one that got away. If Glamp hadn't have shanked that kick off the goalpost, the Steelers would have played in the NFL title. And because for years and years, for what was it, 42 years, the Steelers were the team that never won the title. They were kind of like, I don't know, the Cleveland Indians or the Cardinals franchise are viewed as today as the team that had gone the longest without a title and all that. We're talking to Steve Massey, author of the book Starless Steelers. And the reason I wanted to talk about this is the contributions of Bob Seifers, of Dobyns-Bennett, greatest high school player ever from the Tri-Cities, on that team, the one they traded the great Bill Dudley for, as a matter of fact. But again, it was sort of a motivation. Hey, Seifers will help you with the single wing. And if I can go back to that, game against the Bears one more time, that was a game I believe you mentioned the contributions of Clark Shaughnessy, and I found that very interesting because here was Sutherland, an old single wing guy. Clark Shaughnessy, whose name still comes up, by the way, as an innovator for the Pro Football Hall of Fame. It was under consideration. He wasn't a finalist, but 3 years ago, Shaughnessy was considered for the Pro Football Hall of Fame, and mostly as a coordinator in pro football, but he had actually indirectly succeeded Sutherland at Pitt. And Shaughnessy was a T formation guy. By the way, if you don't know that, the ball in a T formation, basically all offenses today are T formations, derivatives of it, derivatives of the T formation.
I agree.
You snap the ball to the quarterback. Single wing, you snap the ball to the halfback. That's
anybody, right?
Yeah, that's the difference there. So anyway, but I'm just kind of curious. Was there a feeling of after the Bears? We'll never forget the way you thrilled the nation with your T formation, beat the Sutherland single wing. Was there a feeling also of maybe, okay, changing of the guard, and this old smash mouth way of playing football is going to go out of business pretty soon? Was there any feeling of that after that game?
Well, I don't. That's a great observation. I can't directly say that I found that, but it's very plausible, especially after the before the war started, and the war changes everything for the NFL as well as the world. But before World War II started, the Bears had beaten the Redskins in that famous championship game 73-0, and everybody saw the writing on the wall. But John kept running the single wing. But with the Dodgers, he didn't have the commitment to the ownership, the commitment to giving the quality players that he needed. I think you're right. I think that probably was yet another nail in the coffin. The impression that I really got from that Bears game, though, Marky, was just that, they just beat the Steelers up. They just didn't play around. And, when Johnny Zero hit the turf, that's when he blew his elbow out. And that was pretty much the writing on the wall as far as that game went. And then it just extended into kind of a not a spiral downward, but a slow downhill descent after that for the rest of the season.
Now, the other thing I want to talk to you about this is the playoff game. Of course, it's 1947. Yeah. This is before there are tiebreakers in the NFL. Yeah. And my goodness, 2 8-4 teams, we can play a playoff game to go to the NFL championship game. Hey, another gate. I mean, that's how the NFL in those days had to actually think about this. Now, you write about this, and I'm going to call you out on this here because the idea is that Val Jansanti, Charles Cherundolo, who was viewed as the Steelers' greatest center before Mike Webster, and Johnny O. Clement, the first 1,000-yard rusher, they go in to talk to Art Rooney, the chief, and John Holohan, who was the team's GM at the time, and say, wait a minute, we're playing extra. You don't expect us to play for free, do you? And you talk about it that, there's talk that there was this wildcat strike, blah, blah, blah. Wait a minute, it's been overblown. Steve Massey, author of Starless Steelers, I can tell you personally, Bob Seifers went home to Kingsport because he didn't think he was going to get paid. And they literally called him up from Kingsport. He told me that story himself.
I know. I heard your run up to it, and I was very interested in you saying that because it's another person's account, and obviously he was on the team, so he's going to know better than I do. But I personally believe that this is a story that's been stretched out over the years and added on as an excuse. Now, I'm not denigrating Bob at all, or any of the guys on the team. But I think that the strike it's just a little bit hyped up. But now, from what you were saying earlier, I don't have any reason to doubt that. And I want to get the accuracy of the book, right. I want it to be correct. So that's probably something that I need to put in there when I improve the book.
The other thing I would say is you might want to contact, you'd go to Val Jansanti Jr. By the way, Val Jansanti was this great star receiver. He was the first player Steelers history to catch 10 passes in a game. Yes, with the single wing, all of that. He also, and this is my Pittsburgh cred right here, was the last Steeler to play at Duquesne. How about that?
Didn't know that.
Okay, there you go. But here we are. Now, but I'm told by Zeb Jansanti, who is the principal of Bethel Park High School, where Barbara Felton, Agent 99 on Get Smart, went to high school. There you go with that.
Right.
But no, he's in my Rolodex. He told me that, did you know they didn't throw the ball once to Dad in that whole playoff game, which was a 21-0 Eagles victory over the Steelers at Forbes Field. And he felt that because Jansanti was really the first one to say, hey, can we get paid here? That was Sutherland in his last game holding it against Val Jansanti, Zeb's dad, in the game. And did the Jansanti you spoke with, Val Jr., speak of anything like that?
I can tell you this. Val, to go to the Rooney, Val was shoved out on the limb. I mean, because the other guys would basically put him up to it, and he didn't want to do it. And that's what Val Jr. told me. Now, as far as, I cannot believe, I guess, if Val said it to his son, I guess it's something I need to consider. But it's tough for me to believe that Jock would have tampered with the integrity of the game by not throwing the Val. I don't know. I mean, I don't have any reason to doubt you, but it's, again, getting the story right is something that I want to do.
I know that in the playoff game, which was a 21-0 Eagles victory at Forbes Field, the second touchdown, I believe, was set up when Bob, who was just such a great punter, like you said before, he has a single-game punting average in the NFL, it's the seventh oldest record in the NFL, actually outkicked his coverage, and I believe the returner was able to take it back for the touchdown. And, 14-0 third quarter against the single wing, that's going to be tough to come back from, and that was basically the game. So there you are. Anyway, it's Steve Massey. You can get the book Amazon, Barnes & Noble, all that. Go to the bookstore and order it and all that. It's called Starless Steelers, which actually was what the Steelers, you say, were actually nicknamed at that time, despite the fact they had Johnny Clement and such. It probably was the single wing's last hurrah in the NFL. Steelers last used it in 51, then it was gone from the NFL, and basically living up to the Sutherland legacy in doing that. And then the big player on the team, I mean, one of many of the star players on that team, on a Starless team, was certainly Bob Foote Seifers from Kingsport, just 9 years after he led the nation in scoring at Dobyns-Bennett High School. So, Steve, I mean, thanks for keeping that legacy alive. That's all I can say. And I'll enjoy.
Appreciate it.
I'll enjoy talking to you here a little bit later on. I am way behind Tri-City Sports Now.
I got you.
Anyway, now let me talk to you here about this stuff, though, that if you're going to do anything, give me a call if you're going to do any renovation or so with that, because like I said, Bob told me he drove down to Kingsport. I can get you in touch with Zeb Jansanti. I mean, it's Bethel Park High School. It's not that big, but anyway, he still coaches American Legion baseball in Bethel Park, PA. And, and all that. The one curious also thing, though, that I always thought is the Sutherland legacy with Pittsburgh football. And, yeah, I'm talking Pittsburgh football here instead of, but I'm off the air, so I can do that. Of course, Michael Osen replaced him as the coach. They still ran a single wing. Michael Olson then went to Pitt and led the famous no bowl team in 63. Mike Nixon played at Pitt for Sutherland, was the Steelers head coach in 66. And you also mentioned how one of the assistants on that 47 team, Tiger Walton, of course, his son was Chuck Noll's last offensive coordinator.
Yep.
So,
yep. And, you trace that whole bloodline can go all the way back to Pop Warner.
Yeah. So it's that. Yeah. But that also shows you a little bit about just the Sutherland legacy. And I mean, I can go on because I'm a Pitt guy as well. But I mean, just stuff like Alderdice High School in 1967 wins the Pittsburgh City League Championship running the single wing in 1967. I mean, that is Sutherland. He's still around, that's that influence. That's the same thing as Tennessee's got to run the single wing archaically into the 60s because Bob Nealon did it, and that prevents them from having any reasonable chance of recruiting Steve Spurrier from Johnson City. So, I mean,
and that's true.
Yeah, you've got things like that. So, I mean, it's kind of an intriguing story and all that. And that's also, by the way, where I tell you that Sutherland influence. It is also where, if you ever talk to Pitt fans, they really think it's overrated when you say, a Pitt guy has to coach the team. And I'm telling you that it's from the days of we have to have a Pitt guy, and it isn't until Johnny Majors comes in that leads them to a national championship. I'm telling you that's where it was, because for a long, long time, Sutherland was the guy, even after his death, and you were just going to do it his way, So anyway, I'm 40 seconds. I got to go back. So there you go. I appreciate your time.
Greatly appreciate it.
All right. No problem. We'll archive this. I'll send it to you. Talk to you then. Bye.